I'm here with Steve Laser from Democrats for Progress, and we're talking about Ron Paul. Steve recently participated in a show on a broadcast network where he discussed Newt Gingrich. Ron Paul is currently polling first in Iowa and appears to be surging elsewhere. So the question is, can Ron Paul win the Republican nomination?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about that very thing. I'm not sure if people know this about me, but I spend a lot of time on conservative websites like Free Republic and Hot Air, trying to understand how grassroots conservatives think about issues and candidates. Now, while doing that requires me to take a lot of anti-nausea medication, it does give me the ability to really channel the Republican base about how they think about issues and people. And my sense from that research is that it would be very hard for Ron Paul to win the nomination. See, Ron Paul is a libertarian at heart, and his beliefs really reflect that philosophy. And I don't think the Republican base is ready to embrace libertarianism. For instance, the Republican base just got finished supporting the Bush Doctrine for 8 years. And the Bush Doctrine, and if Sarah Palin is watching, she might want to pay attention since she couldn't articulate what that was in an interview. It's a policy that advocates an aggressive military posture that allows for first strike against countries on the mere threat that they might be a danger to us at some point in the future. And libertarians hate the idea of the Bush Doctrine, and you would know this within seconds of Ron Paul talking about foreign policy. See, Ron Paul believes it's partially our fault due to our own meddling that we have such bad relations in the Middle East, and that we have been attacked also due to that meddling. He wants to reduce military spending by half, and he wants to reduce our military presence overseas, and I don't think Republicans are ready to embrace any of that. When you watch one of the debates and Paul says one of those things, you see these pained looks on members of the audience, like someone just hammered a nail into one of their pinkies. So the vast majority of Republicans strongly object to those kind of positions. And on social issues, Paul is pro-legalization of marijuana and against the war on drugs in general. Republicans have been on the opposite side of those issues during the past 30 to 40 years. So Paul's ability to capture the Republican nomination is going to depend on whether the base is willing to do a quick 180-degree turn on those issues. So the big question is, can Ron Paul convince the Republican base to change their mind on those issues? If he can, he's got a shot at the nomination. And if he can't, he won't win the nomination. I'm betting that the Republican base isn't willing to go libertarian just yet. Now, I hope they do, and I hope I'm proven wrong, because I think a race between Ron Paul and President Obama would be fascinating.
Well, since you recently did a show about Newt Gingrich, how does someone like Ron Paul compare to Newt Gingrich?
Wow. Well, for folks generally on the same side of the aisle who both profess to be true conservatives, it's hard to imagine two people being more different. Ron Paul's affable, Newt Gingrich isn't likable. Ron Paul has been about the most reliable right-wing libertarian on economic issues and taxes as one can imagine. He should change his name to Steady Eddie as far as I'm concerned. While Newt Gingrich is the flop to Mitt Romney's flip. The two of them, Mitt and Newt, have been on both sides of so many issues, it's hard to keep up at this point. Marijuana legalization, health care mandates, the Libyan war, the Palestinian issue. Gingrich has been all over the place on those issues. Ron Paul has been a faithful husband for close to 50 years. Gingrich seems to have gone to the Tiger Woods school of marital infidelity. And, finally, Ron Paul, as mentioned earlier, has some policy positions that make the Republican base uncomfortable. Newt Gingrich does not offer any current policy positions that make the Republican base uncomfortable. The contrast between the two men is really stark. And if you're a Republican and those are your two favorite candidates, you really have an interesting choice.
I heard something about Ron Paul and racist newsletters. What's that all about? And will it be a problem for Paul? And how concerned should African Americans be about these newsletters?
This is one of those issues that's going to be hard to get away from if you're Ron Paul. Particularly if he wins a couple of primaries or becomes a nominee. When people really start taking a more careful look at him, people are going to take a really hard look at this newsletter issue and try to determine if it means he's unacceptable. If you're at all sensitive to issues of race and equality, I think it's going to be hard to get past some of the things said in these newsletters sent out in Paul's name. The newsletters contain some pretty strong racist statements in addition to odd conspiracy theories about gays and AIDS. Like after the 1992 riots in Los Angeles, a newspaper opined that order was only restored when it came time for blacks to pick up their welfare checks. Given the inefficiencies of what D.C. laughingly calls the criminal justice system, I think we can assume that 95% of black men are partial criminals or criminals. We're constantly told that it is evil to be afraid of black men, but that's hardly irrational. One referred to Martin Luther King as the world-class philanderer who beats up his paramours and seduces young girls and boys. And another referred to Barbara Jordan, the civil rights activist and congressperson is Barbara the Moron. You know, what's also going to hurt Ron Paul is that he's given several different answers over the past 16 years to explain these newsletters. In '96, he took full responsibility and said some of the things written in them were taken out of context. In 2008, when running for president, Paul said the newsletters were ghostwritten. He didn't write the racist stuff, but because the newsletters carried the name, he was responsible for them and their content. So, you know, he now insists that he didn't write these things. But he also hasn't been able to say who wrote the offensive content, which I think is curious. And, you know, I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of hate mail from angry Ron Paul supporters for talking about this issue, but it's an issue that's out there and it's not going away.
If nominated, can Ron Paul beat Barack Obama in the general election, and what kind of a general election candidate would he be?
Well, first I want to say right now that Paul is polling fairly well against the president. Some have him even doing better than Barack Obama and other Republican candidates. I would say, though, that this may be because he's much less well known than other candidates, and when people start taking a closer look, they might find things about him that they just don't like, you know, but they haven't seen that much of him yet. You know, I think we can get some insight about what kind of candidate he'd be by seeing the kind of candidate he is when running for the Republican nomination. He's no shrinking violet, I will tell you that. You know, as nice as he seems to be, if you look at the commercials and ads he has out attacking Newt Gingrich, there's no way you could mistake him as someone who might be tentative when it comes to going negative. He's been relentless pressing the attacks on Gingrich. You know, I think it's Paul and not so much Mitt Romney who has taken down Newt Gingrich in Iowa. You know, Paul accused Gingrich of selling access and profiteering from his time in government, calling him a serial hypocrite. You know, hard-hitting stuff. You know, so if Paul got the nomination, we could expect him to vigorously and repeatedly rehash all of the standard attacks we've seen the Republicans levy against the president. You know, I don't think I need to mention them here. I think the Republicans have said it so many times that the two of us could probably recite them in our sleep. But, you know, if Ron Paul wins the nomination, it means he's been able to get a sizable amount of the Republican base to buy into libertarianism. You know, I mentioned that idea earlier. Whether he's got a shot in the general election would turn on how large of a percentage of the Republicans he's brought into libertarianism, who have they bought into it, and are they enthusiastic about it? And the folks that have been supporting Ron Paul for many years, they're enthusiastic, but they're not a big enough group. You know, his campaign would need to be able to bring in a lot of folks from the base to enthusiastically support him. That's going to be very hard. You know, very hard. Traditionally, you know, the religious right has provided most of the energy and volunteer bodies for a Republican nominee. And the religious right is pretty suspicious of Paul, as they normally are of any libertarian. He's had to spend a lot of time in Iowa courting the religious right and assuaging their fears. The folks who have, you know, traditionally supported Republicans because they support a strong military and an aggressive foreign policy will not be enthusiastic for Paul at all. So those are two strikes against him. You know, the aggressive foreign policy folks may even stay home. Don't forget, in places like Free Republic and other conservative websites, I've seen discussions that indicate they believe that all foreign policy should be run out of the Secretary of Defense's office. So Republicans will have a hard time warming up to Ron Paul's foreign policy. So in short, I think Ron Paul loses the election. I think Paul strategists are hoping to win some crossover votes from progressives based on Paul's anti-war positions. You know, the problem for Paul and his campaign is a not so little thing called Occupy Wall Street. So while Occupy's anti-war, they've also refocused national attention on policies that benefit the 1% at the expense of the 99%. And virtually all of Ron Paul's economic policy proposals would increase the wealth disparity and benefit the 1% while hurting the rest of the 99%. When it becomes better known that Paul intends to slash spending on everything by 50%, and I mean everything, I don't think he'll have more than a handful of progressives in his camp. And to that point, I called Code Pink on their general line, and I spoke to someone over there and asked them if Ron Paul was the nominee, could they see any possibility of Code Pink endorsing him or any of their members voting for him, and they gave me a one-word answer: no. I also had a conversation via email with David Swanson, author of the book War is a Crime, who's probably the most anti-war person that I know. And while he said that he considers Paul's foreign policy better than Obama's, he won't be spending 10 months deciding which choice is more horrendous. So he refers to Ron Paul as a horrendous choice. So if Ron Paul can't get that segment of the progressive community to even consider voting for him, he's going to get close to 0% of the progressive vote in a general election. Now, beyond that, I don't think Paul would look good in a one-on-one debate with the president. The idea of looking and sounding presidential is very important to Americans. You know, Ron Paul just doesn't come across nearly as presidential as Barack Obama, and that's not something that I don't think he can change. So if he gets there, I think the president beats Paul by around 60 to 40% in the popular vote, and the president probably wins a minimum of 40 states.